right here on 5:31 PI, bringing Pacific people together. Time is 6 minutes past 10 o'clock. For more than 130 years, Pacific farmers have been cultivating and exporting fine flavor cacao varieties. In Samoa, cacao is highly consumed locally, and now the secret is out as New Zealand chocolaters and fruit producers are discovering the goodness and convenience of sourcing premium quality beans from the Pacific Islands. Floris Niu is the founder of Miss Sunshine Farms, which is her cacao plantation, and is building an agro-tourism market from it. Floris is also the event producer for the upcoming Pacific Cacao and Chocolate 2022 show. Floris is on the line with us now from Samoa, and we say talofa lava and good morning, Floris. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning.
Talofa lava e te whakatau lava mole avangoa. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come back on the show. Thank you.
The pleasure is all ours. For those of our listeners who might have missed our first chat, our first talanoa, could you tell us, how did you get into growing cocoa?
I guess it wasn't a conscious decision to become a cocoa farmer. It was a very big journey for me personally, and having to go back home after some, major things that happen in life. And I ended up back on my grandparents' farm, and I saw the cocoa pods, and that was kind of like a sign for me. And yeah, and here I am 8 years later, and I'm still working in cocoa and hopefully trying to make a difference in our community.
Now, your grandparents' farm, were they growing it to sell locally or internationally, or was it just cocoa that was growing on the land?
In our village in Tuanai, which is about halfway between up here and the airport, on the north side of Upolu, is one of the biggest growing cocoa areas in Upolu. So it is kind of like a tradition. I'm a fourth generation grower from that area. So it has been since the time that we had been exporting to the world cocoa in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then obviously in the 60s, when everyone decided to come to New Zealand, we had a bit of a dip there. But yeah, so I have been, my family have been in cocoa for a very long time. And so it is a tradition that I subconsciously am continuing.
And in terms of the local growers, you say it's an area that sells it. Do you have associations there? Are there many of our villagers still growing cocoa now? Or are you one of the few families in the village in Tuanai?
There's a big move for cocoa since 2014. There was an interest from Whitakers in Sapai Koko. And of course, Sapai Koko supplies Whitakers and other companies as well. And of course, now with a lot of the projects and the development work that's been done through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia and New Zealand, DFAT and MFAT. So there's a big effort, for that. But I kind of fell into it accidentally. I didn't know that was going on. It just seemed to be all happening at the same time. I happened to be there in 2014, and all of these things were kind of taking place. And I think it's about that thing of being in the right place at the right time. But I think a deep personal journey for me is just the passion to continue the work of my parents and grandparents and kind of utilize the land and make them proud.
Have you expanded on the cocoa plantations? How long do the trees last? Do you need to replant? Or once they are grown and established, they just keep producing?
The great thing about Samoa is that we've got, trees from way back in, say, the 40s and 50s, plants that would have been grown. So, trees can last up to 100, even more than 100 years. But obviously, for good yield and production, you need to continuously replenish your plantation. So I did replant some of the land that was, given to me to look after as part of the custodian of that land. And so I planted out a brand new plantation and expanded on the old plantation on our particular land. So my brother and I work on that as a team. And there are many other families sort of coming back and doing that same thing. And I think it's wonderful because all throughout the Pacific, there seems to be a conscious movement of cacao and cocoa. And I think this is really great. Samoa is placed so beautifully in that space because we have a culture of consuming cacao, unlike the other Pacific islands who didn't initially have that. So we kind of a little bit have the upper hand, but we're all working together as a region and as a Pacific community together to build and premiumize our cocoa beans in the world. So it's really just gaining that recognition. Yeah,
absolutely. And you're absolutely right, because we have traveled extensively around the Pacific and no one drinks cocoa the way that we do. It is now part of our tradition. You as a family, despite the fact that you do work in cocoa, do you still do your own cocoa, homemade cocoa?
Absolutely. I'm also a chocolate producer. So I don't produce commercially Koko Samoa because I think there's a lot of families in the villages who are doing that. And I think it's about time that we kind of moved on and make, build new recipes and build new markets for ourselves. I think we continue to have the tradition, but also not be afraid to have new traditions. And that's what this whole cacao and chocolate show is for the Pacific, which is coming up in July the 23rd.
Yeah. Tell us about the Pacific Cacao and Chocolate. What brought that about?
I think, as I've mentioned earlier, I think it's just really about being passionate and having a deeper connection with cacao. That's kind of what really came from that, but also just a need for the Pacific to be recognized in the world. We needed to put ourselves on the world map, that we grow premium cacao varieties, but not only that, we process and we export premium cacao varieties. And the only way to kind of build on that is to let the world know and to put you up against, other people who are growing cacao and other countries where cacao originates, Central and South America, and then obviously Africa being one of the biggest growing areas as well. But the wonderful thing about the Pacific is that we don't have some of those dark bits of the history with, slavery and cacao. It's very much a family affair, and it's very much, like for myself, I grew up as a toddler, being dragged off to the Makeki in front of Molesi to sell cocoa beans with my mum and dad. So, it's really deeply inset inside my body. So I think that's nothing to be ashamed of. And I think also people, you build on that. You build on what your parents built for you and your grandparents built for you. And I think if you can do that and bring lots of people together who are all passionate about cacao, and then obviously we've got the producers in New Zealand, the chocolate manufacturers, or I should say the craft chocolate makers, which is very different. And they have a very, very deep and ethical connection with cacao, and it really suits the movement that's happening also in the Pacific. And so for us to come together, New Zealand, Aotearoa is the part of the Pacific, along with Australia, and I think we all need to support each other in this time, since it's so difficult to drag our beans across the Great Divide. I think it's great to be able to support each other in our economies. Yeah.
How unique is the cocoa from Samoa to the rest of the world?
We have varieties that are the same or similar to varieties that are grown in other parts of the world. But what is different is that sometimes we have this thing called cross-pollination, and each different land or each different climate kind of helps to produce its own, unique varieties and its own unique flavors in that. And I think for over so many years, we've had a melonado, which comes from obviously forastero type, if people understand cocoa, and then Trinitario, or what we know as Koko Samoa, is a variety that's very common and it has a very fine flavor. So it's a cross between the very fine Criollo, which is a very non-acidic type of bean, and then, the very a melonado, which is, some people call it Solomon cocoa, Koko Solomona, which is a little bit bitter and a bit more acidic. So we have the Trinitario, which is like a cross between those two. So we're right somewhere in the finer middle. But I think, the flavor profiles are different in many different ways. It's not just because of the variety, it's because of how the chocolatier or the chocolate maker is actually going to roast the beans and then to make the chocolate, how long they're going to grind it for, and so on. And each of that, the flavor changes from the fermentation to the making of the actual chocolate. So there are many different parts to it. And that's what's so exciting, because these conversations can now happen, under one roof, with all of these people coming together and sharing their knowledge and sharing, the passion and their motivation for working with cacao and cocoa.
Who are some of the exhibitors from around the Pacific who are going to be at the Pacific Cacao and Chocolate Show 2022?
Oh yeah, well we've got some great people. Like obviously you've met Una Brown, who's also one of the judges, cacao ambassador. We've got Whitakers, and we have a number of living koko from Australia over in Melbourne. We've got some wonderful people in New Zealand, small chocolate makers, Raglan. We've got Aoteakarete. We've got so many people that are willing to support this very first show in cacao. And most of the chocolate makers that are going to exhibit are craft chocolate makers. So it's a very different kind of process. So it's not just any massive, company or manufacturer that just spits out chocolate. These are very conscious and, ethical chocolate makers who take the beans and they turn it into chocolate bars without messing with it too much, without adding, a whole lot of things. So it's all about the flavor of the bean coming through the chocolate bar rather than trying to disguise it and adding new flavors to it. So, and I think that's the unique thing about this lot of exhibitors. Yeah.
And in terms of the Pacific, where the cacao is coming from, obviously Samoa is going to be there. Where are some of the other regions?
Sure. So we've got Vanuatu. We have a partnership with New Caledonia. We've got Fiji, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Bougainville. We have the Philippines as well. Our friends over there, and then we're hopefully going to get somebody from Hawaii too, but we're still confirming all of those things. We're 3 months away from the show, so there's still time for anyone else in the Pacific who grows cacao and who's producing some sort of bar with it, or even just exporting the beans, to join us in the show and support it.
Speaking of the show, when and where will it be?
So it's at the Mount Smart Stadium. July 23rd is the live show. We do have 2 webinars that are associated with the show, and this is just to enable the show to have a virtual component as well. So we're going to run a webinar before the live show, and then we have the live show on the 23rd, and then we have a final webinar after the week after the show. So all of those parts are really important, because during this time when people can't travel, we're able to connect through live streaming and also connecting through panelists on those webinars as well, before and after the show. So there is, we plan to connect much deeper with this lot of people than you would ever in a normal show, in a normal trade show or expo. So this is much more than a trade show or an expo. This is a celebration. It's the first time that anyone has celebrated Pacific cacao and chocolate together, all coming together in Aotearoa. And I think it's really wonderful, Aotearoa being central to all of us and supporting us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Are there going to be competitions as part of the show?
Absolutely. There are 6 competitions that we've put on, and one of them is the Pacific Cup, which is why it was so essential to have, you know, participants from all over the Pacific so that they could participate in that competition. And the winner will be the country, of course. And there is a competition which involves Samoa, solely because we are taking the Samoan beans to the Cocoa of Excellence, which is a major awards in Paris. So our show is, we have a slogan from the Pacific to Paris, and it's about telling that story of taking our beans all the way to Paris to a very prestigious award and competition that recognizes us. And it really just comes from that desire to have recognition on the world stage about our beans. And yes, we've had samples sent to Paris before, and we've had samples from all around the world. P&G does very well in those awards, having very unique beans. But I think the more we do this, the more recognition that we get as a region of supplying this, you know, great and premium variety, premium quality beans. So yeah, there are many other competitions. We even have a Koko Samoa competition and a hot chocolate competition. We have so many things coming on. There's something in there for everybody, for youth, innovators. So it's really, really an exciting time to come together and celebrate, but also to support the growing craft chocolate industry in New Zealand, which is, you know, somewhat has been there for a while, but we're still, you know, building up and connecting with them so they understand the flavors of the Pacific. And it's just an inroads for other value chains that we have in the Pacific that we can share with New Zealand and Australia. And I think that's where that whole regional thinking is about. And I think all of our governments are in support of that as well.
Wonderful. Ms. Sunshine Farms founder and events producer Floris Niu providing a farmer's perspective about the upcoming Pacific Cacao and Chocolate 2022 Expo that's going to be held at Mount Smart Stadium from the 23rd of July 2022. Whaftai te lava for your time, Floris. And we look forward to the show. Boy, oh boy, I want to be at that show.
Great, you need to be there and taste some chocolate. Wonderful, thank you so much for having me.
You're absolutely welcome. You're listening to Early Edition with Ete. 5:31 PI is the station that brings Pacific people together. Our news in Lea Whakatonga is coming up next. Here's Daniel Ray Costello with Samba.